Lucy says, I'm intrigued by this view you have on the purpose of life, Charlie Brown. You say we're put here on earth to make others happy. Charlie Brown replies, that's right. Lucy says, what are the others put here for? Well, that's a very good question. What I want to talk about today is where kindness comes from, and more specifically, where altruism comes from. And this is really a question that mankind has been contemplating since the beginning of time. Different religious traditions have offered the notion of a God creating man in his own image. That's where kindness comes from. Secular traditions have spoken about the use of reason to reach the good and the right. In general, the fault lines have been, are we talking about some kind of inheritance, whether divine or natural, or is this a construction? And for the first time in the 19th century, this man, Charles Darwin, made it a scientific problem. Because when he was writing on the origin of species, he perceived immediately that here was a paradox. What is the paradox? How does one explain the persistence of traits that reduce fitness if evolution is a story of survival of the fittest? It seems not to make sense. And in fact, Darwin wrote, every complex structure and instinct should be useful to the possessor. Natural selection could never produce in a being anything injurious to itself, for natural selection acts solely by and for the good of each. And yet natural selection had produced an enormous amount of altruism. I'd like to give you a number of examples from the natural world. So these are honeypot ants from the American deserts. And their sole job in life is to hang upside down backwards, like great big pots of sugared water, and wait until they're tapped by the queen or its brood whenever they're thirsty. In other words, these are lifelong wet nurses. That's all they do in life. These are termites. Entire castes of termites forego reproduction altogether. They do not reproduce. Their fitness equals 0. No children, no progeny. This is a very well-known case of the honeybee, the stinging bee. When the bee stings, the sting is launched inside the skin, and it really eviscerates the stomach of the honeybee. The honeybee has sacrificed itself for its brothers and sisters. But altruistic behavior isn't limited to what are called the social insects, or the Hymenoptera. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a social amoeba called Discotyledon discoideum. Now, the amoeba usually is single-celled, autonomous, individual, single-celled organism, burrows in the ground, and it does very well there. Except when times are tough, it emits a chemical signal, a cyclic AMP. And all the rest of the amoeba in the area do the same. And they begin to converge on this gradient of the chemical signal. And when they come together, they create a slug. Now, this slug is now an individual, autonomous organism. And each one of the formerly autonomous amoeba have now given up their individuality, and they are now cells in the body of this one single being. Now, the single being has sensors. It has sensors for light and for air, and it sort of walks around the forest. And when it finds light and air, then something unbelievable happens. The top 20% of the slug, the head of the slug, create out of their bodies a kind of stalk, which allows the bottom 80% to shimmy up the stalk and to create a kind of orb. You see, it looks like a lollipop. Now, these are spores, and now they have a good chance of being carried away by a felicitous wind or on the wings of an unsuspecting insect. So what's happened is the top 20% have sacrificed themselves for the bottom 80%. Other examples include plants. This is a yellow jewelweed, which under conditions of light deprivation doesn't do what you would expect it to do if it was an egoist, quote unquote. In other words, it doesn't allocate energy to the creation of leaves in order to soak up as much sun as it can, but rather puts its energies into other things, into stems and so forth, and so doesn't, in order to help its brothers and sisters who are around it. Altruistic behavior. In gazelles, very well-known behavior, you have particular sentry gazelles who, when they locate a predator lurking in the grass, engage in something called starting behavior, which is basically they jump up and down very high, 6 feet, ostensibly drawing all the fire of the lion and allowing the rest of the troop to escape. This is the mammalian equivalent of the termite. It's called the blind African mole rat, a very good-looking organism. And its behavior is exactly equal to the behavior of termites. In other words, entire cases of individuals forego reproduction altogether so that this good looker, the queen, can produce all the progeny. Baboons. Baboons spend an inordinate amount of time cleaning each other, grooming behavior. Now, time is a proxy for fitness, because they could have been doing other things with their time that would have helped their fitness. And so this is also considered altruistic behavior. By the way, if anyone in the audience has children who need to be cleaned, baboons are very good cleaners. Throughout the 20th century, science has provided a number of answers to the question, where does altruism come from? How could have altruism evolved if, in fact, this is some kind of paradox? And I'm going to go over them very briefly. The three that I'm going to talk about, which are the main ones, are nepotism, reciprocation, and group selection. So the first one is nepotism. You can read the cartoon. The guy who formalized it mathematically was a man by the name of Bill Hamilton. And this is basically the notion that altruism can evolve if it happens between kin, between members of the same family. Now, this is based on a particular point of view, the point of view of the gene. In other words, the gene doesn't care in what body it advances into the next generation, as long as the same gene advances into the next generation. So basically, this is an idea which was cribbed in a way from another genius, and this is apocryphal, but I'll tell it because it's a nice story anyway. This guy, JBS Haldane, who apparently, over his 17th beer in a pub in London, sort of blurted out, "I'll give my life for 2 brothers and 8 cousins." This is the logic of the gene's eye point of view. And this is the notion that altruism can come if it happens between kin. The next idea is the idea of reciprocation, advanced most famously by a man by the name of Bob Trivers. And this is basically the simple notion of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So you can already sort of imagine that into this kind of dynamic, you can have tools like game theory doing a lot of work. The final idea is this idea, group selection. Group selection is to say that if 2 groups are competing, which group will be more successful? The altruistic group, or a group with many altruists, or a group with, as opposed to a group with less altruists, with more egoists? What do you think? The altruists. The altruists are all cooperating with one another, and so they'll be more successful than a group where people are out for themselves, or organisms are out for themselves. However, within the group, what does it pay to be? It pays to be an egoist, because the egoist doesn't pay any kind of tax. And so you see with the evolution of altruism, it's a kind of trait where there's an inherent conflict between the interest of the individual and the interest of the group. And the idea of group selection is to say that sometimes natural selection can work at the level of the group rather than at the level of the individual. Now, everything that I've been telling you about until now has to do with biological altruism. And biological altruism is something very different than psychological altruism. I'll explain what I mean. Biological altruism is defined by the result of a behavior. So if you've acted in such a way so as to confer a fitness benefit on someone else, on another organism, while incurring some kind of fitness cost, then you are, by definition, an altruist, which is why we can have altruistic amoeba. Now, this is something very different from psychological altruism, the kind of altruism that we talk about when we talk about altruism between human beings. I think the unlucky bunny illustrates this very well. The unlucky bunny helps the old lady across the street. Now, even if the unlucky bunny is killed by a truck while doing so, if the old lady knows that the intention of the unlucky bunny was to be written into the will of the old lady, and that's why he did it, that's why he was kind, then she and everyone else will rightly not consider him an altruist. In other words, psychological altruism is all about intention. Biological altruism doesn't even subsume mind. That's why amoeba can be altruists in the biological sense. But of course, the mind, the organ which allows for intention to begin with, is like any other part of our biological being, something which has been subject to the ruthless call of natural selection. It's not apart from the body. So the real question, and the question that we're all interested in, many scientists for many years have been interested in, what is the connection? Is there a connection? And what is the connection? How can we define it between biological altruism on the one hand and psychological altruism on the other? I want to tell you briefly about this man, George Price, who in a way teaches us a very important lesson about our attempts to understand psychological altruism, altruism in human beings, based on our understanding of altruism in nature. George Price was a very unusual individual, a kind of mix between a Forrest Gump character and a Rain Man character, incredibly brilliant, very, very strange socially. Probably, I mean, we're all somewhere on a spectrum, but he was probably closer on the autism spectrum to one side than most. A man whom was born in New York in 1922, a man whose interviewers at Harvard University, when he arrived as a 17-year-old boy, said of him, may go haywire, but will never be humdrum, which is to say, he might go crazy, but he'll never be boring. And that was really spot on true about this guy. Like Forrest Gump, he found himself at the center of different scientific and technological revolutions in the 20th century, working as a chemist in the Manhattan Project, then making very important inventions on transistor research with people like Shockley and Bardeen at Bell Labs, leaving that becoming an oncologist, leaving that becoming a writer, then inventing computer-aided design for IBM, but not taking out a patent, joining IBM as a low-rung worker, and then obviously with computer-aided design, IBM made a lot of money off of his invention. What happened to this man was that sometime in the 60s, he underwent a crisis. And he decided that life really wasn't worth living anymore. And so he left his family, left his job against the good wishes of all his best friends, left his country, and decided to move to England to try his hand to crack one last great mystery. And that was the mystery of where does altruism come? Where does kindness and altruism come from? And he moved to England, and within a very, very short period of time, he wrote a very short paper, which he was able to somehow publish in Nature. No one knew who he was. He wasn't part of any kind of community. He had never trained in biology, had no formal training in evolutionary biology. And he wrote an equation. You can't read this, but there are no references here. Absolutely no references. So it was completely sui generis. Came out of nowhere. And he walked off the street literally into what was then one of the best genetics department in the world at University College London, and showed it to a professor who had no idea who he was, and said, is this new? And within about 5 minutes had an honorary professorship and keys to his own office. And then went home, and I won't go through the whole story because we're short on time, but when he began thinking about this equation philosophically, his very unusual mind concluded that the meaning of the equation is that altruism is always self-interest in disguise. Whether it's helping the gene or the individual or the group, altruism is always a kind of self-interest. In other words, the best that the natural process can do is a kind of second-hand goodness, not a pure kindness. And this was a terrible realization to him because by this time he had become an evangelical Christian. Like I said, a very unusual guy. And he decided that he wasn't going to, he didn't agree to take this on board. He was going to try to fight it. In other words, he was going to try to fight his own miraculous equation, which came out of nowhere. And so he began a program of radical altruism in his own life to try to show that the human spirit could do what the natural process could not do. Namely, to bring about true, pure, genuine selflessness. And so he went out to the streets of London. Again, this guy came out of nowhere. He had no friends. No one knew who he was. And he began helping homeless people, drunks, people living sort of down and out in the streets. It began by saying, hello, my name is George. Here's a pound. Here's a sandwich. It graduated to him inviting many, many homeless people into his home. And in the end, this is George in the fall of 1974 in London, already down to skin and bones. He had nothing. He was very glad for it because what it meant to him was that indeed the spirit could transcend what nature could produce. Finally, though, the story is not a very happy one. He could not explain to himself whether his own motivations of selflessness were not really self-interested. And this inability finished him off. And he ended his life tragically in a squat in Kentish Town in London in the winter of 1975. This is a photo that I took of his grave in 2008. Now, this isn't his grave. His grave is here in the brush. So he died completely anonymous, no tombstone, until this very day. Now, the reason I bring the example of George Price is because his story shows, and in fact, when you look at the history of attempts to solve the problem of altruism when it comes to human beings, to try to use what we know from nature in order to understand our own deep motivations, it's clear that we often, this is just the case, it's a fact, we often fall into two very, very sort of deep biases or fallacies. One of them is the naturalistic fallacy, which is basically the naturalistic fallacy which was explained by David Hume already in the 18th century, is to confuse that which is with that that ought to be, which ought to be. So a kind of category confusion. The second one is originalism, which is basically to say, if I've understood the origin of something, then I've understood that something. And the fact of the matter is that scientists trying to work on the origin of altruism throughout, ever since Darwin, and including until this day, often fall into these two fallacies. Now, we have actually someone in the audience who was responsible for this paper up here. And I'd like you to train your eyes on this. Today, the reason why this is important is because George Price died in 1975, but the search for the origins of kindness continue, and they continue in full force. And science uses a battery of different tools to try to locate kindness. One of the tools that we use today is genetics. And in a study that was actually conducted in this university, you take a bunch of students and you give them 100 shekels or something like that, and you say, okay, you have a one-off, non-iterated meeting with a stranger. And you can do whatever you want with this 100. You can give them the whole 100, give them 70, give them 50, give them 20, give nothing at all. And then you tabulate the results of the behavior. And then you take a swab from these people's mouth and you genotype them. You look for certain genetic markers that might be in correlation. Genetic markers that we know that play some kind of role in what is called, say, prosocial behavior in rats. Okay, these are genetic markers in this particular case that have to do with a molecule called vasopressin or oxytocin. I can't remember which one. Oxytocin. Another picture that I want you to look at, this I took at Stanford some time ago at a place called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford University. A lot of money going into this. There they try to actually locate the place in the brain which is responsible for altruism with the help of tools like fMRI. Now this is the photo of a brain of a Tibetan monk, because we all know that Tibetan monks are all that more altruistic than the rest of us. Now, the reason I mention these things is because these are very interesting results, right? But they're also incredibly reductive, and they make it very easy to fall into one of the biases, either of the naturalistic bias or the bias of originalism. And I'm going to end with this. I mean, when we think about altruism in humans, the real problem that we grapple with individually, and which obviously George Price himself grappled with, is a problem that Aristotle himself pointed his finger at many years ago. And that is that the love we feel for others stems from the love we feel for ourselves. How can you know when you perform some kind of act of kindness towards a fellow human being, whether you're doing it because you really want to help that human being or because you get something out of it? There's some kind of disguised self-interest. It doesn't have to be disguised, and it doesn't have to be conscious, by the way. It could be some visceral feeling, some bodily reaction. Well, that's a very good question. And I want to end with the thought that in trying to think about that question, we might not have a better guide than this man behind me, who was a tortured soul himself, Wittgenstein. who said that even after we've answered all the possible scientific questions that we can posit, we still will have not scratched the true problems of humanity. And at this point, there will be no more questions left, and that is precisely the answer. So I think that altruism is a kind of problem that lives very much at the nexus between science and society, between biology and evolution and culture. And at these type of very sort of sensitive and important nexuses, we have to remember the very sage words of Wittgenstein. When George Price killed himself, Bill Hamilton, who's the guy who I told you before was the man responsible for formalizing the idea of kin selection, he loved him very much. He was one of the only people in the world who understood what a genius this man was and how important his equation explaining the origins of kindness was. And he fought his way into the squat after George died. He actually fought his way into the squat. And there was a sort of bloodied linoleum floor where the body had been found. He found a little scrap of paper. It was written in George Price's handwriting. And this is what it said: "Men and women have always yearned for understanding, compassion, forgiveness, and deeds of loving kindness from their fellow men. But often they've been sadly disappointed. And today, more than ever, in a world torn by strife and dissension, the crying need is for a real demonstration of love. You see, love would pour the oil of quietness upon the troubled waters of human relationships, heal the ugly wounds of strife and contention, and bring together those separated by hatred, jealousy, and selfishness." I think that the case of George Price, who really is responsible for a formalization, which is our best crack until this very day, at the dynamics of natural selection, and within that dynamic of the evolution of a trait like altruism, I think it's clear that the kind of love that he's talking about here is something that cannot be fit on a mathematical equation, and that's something that we should all be very, very happy about. Thank you very much.